My name is Mutsawashe Mutendi. I am a medical anthropologist. I am a Pan-Africanist, and I am an advocate for justice in mining communities, and I'm particularly interested in maternal health and mining, as well as respiratory diseases among miners. Welcome to the Adler Museum of Medicine, and today I will be in conversation with two artists. We're going to be talking about medical sociology, medical anthropology, the biopolitics of disease and disability within a decolonial context. We will be focusing on 4 themes, which will be the pharmaceutical industrial complex. We will also be focusing on breath, the politics and the poetry of breathing, treatment and the violent gaze, as well as diagnostics and the violent gaze that comes with diagnostics. And so I'm going to open up the space for you guys to introduce yourselves. And I guess I just want to leave with a comment that I often think of myself as a bearer of stories, the stories of my research participants. And the decolonial project is so important because I think it's important to also produce knowledge from the global south. And most of the knowledge in medicine comes from the global north. So I think that is very important. And I think the other important thing is that decolonial practices allow us to tell stories with integrity and, most of all, care. So over to you, ladies. Stacy, do you want to start?
I'm Stacy Hardy, and I suppose, many people find their topic, or many artists, I'm an artist and a writer and a researcher, and many artists find their topic by something that interests them. And I always like to joke that my topic found me, because I became very interested in exploring biomedicine, biopolitics, the biopolitics of health, via my own experience of living for 8 years with undiagnosed tuberculosis. And I suppose there were 2 main things that emerged from that experience. And the first thing was living with a disease that did not have a name, and when I did not know what was, but I was very aware something had changed in my body and there was something in my body. And to a large extent, I developed quite a complex relationship with the bacteria. What I later discovered were the bacteria that were inhabiting me. I might go so far as to say I developed a love affair with my bacteria, or at least they became so intertwined with who I was as a human being after 8 years that I really struggled with the idea of separating where does Stacy end and where does TB microbacterium begin. And the other thing that happened with the discovery when I finally got my diagnosis, anybody who knows tuberculosis, it's a disease that literally eats holes in your organs. And I started to research, became interested in it, obviously, because finally I had a diagnosis after many, many years of struggling. And I followed the holes that TB had eaten in my body. And those holes, when I got to the end of them, I emerged into a mine shaft. And the reason I say this is because the history of tuberculosis in South Africa cannot be separated with the history of colonialism, colonial extraction economies, and mining. And that led me to quite a deep inquiry of what it meant. I suddenly found myself in a very different community to what, I found myself in a community of miners as TB sufferers, and starting to ask questions about myself as a white South African and my own history, my own family history within colonialism. How much was I responsible for propagating TB? Was the TB a kind of punishment? And also what is my responsibility to those other voices that died or have died for my wealth and for my well-being.
And I think, Stacy, you've raised like very important points, and I think this is why we're in the space of collaborations, because there's so many intersections between the work I do on TB and minors, and you delve into the historical aspects, that we cannot separate TB in South Africa without looking at the history of mining. Louise, over to you.
Thank you. My name is Louise Westerhout. I am a queer, disabled artist and therapist and educator and activist. I am non-binary, so my pronouns are she, they. And as an artist, and as a therapist, I think what's really important and what is binding us here is that we want to be able to help the people who are listening to this today maybe find some comfort or some education or some clarity on their experience. I know for myself, my avatar is a cyborg witch or capitalist machine, because this body has probably had about 2 to 4 million rand spent on it in the last 17 years. And every question I've had along the way is, was it worth it, and who must I serve if I stay? So I think a huge part of decolonial practice is service, it's community, it's compassion for, it's trying to understand where our intersections are. For me, the intersection of my decolonial practice is disability, the issues of ableism, it's queerphobia, it's as a non-binary older person, ageism, and then I try to intersect anti-speciesism to everyone's reluctance as much as I can, because that is my practice. So I always try to squeeze it in. My invitation here is for anyone who is a cancer survivor or a disabled person or a queer disabled person, that I hope that you find some comfort and some clarity here. Hope you find some strength. And this is also an invitation to doctors and practitioners in the Western medical service. You do need to learn some things. You do need to listen more, and you do need to be more aware.
If I can also invite all the TB bacteria out there, this is also an invitation to you to be part of this conversation.
I would like to invite creative practitioners to play. Producing articles is not the only way to talk about issues around health and the issues we're going to focus on today. So to be able to play and be creative and find alternative ways of producing knowledge that are on the same level as the academy. And I want to push back against this idea that the academy is like the hegemonic way to produce knowledge. So breath is such an important and an involuntary function that we participate in. And having breath or having interruptions on breath or having breath interrupted is linked to so many social, economic, political, and historical factors. And I think what's really amazing about the work we do is the synergies around breath, where I do look at work, especially my work on I'm Like a Bubblegum, which was a statement from a miner, where breath was interrupted and one got TB and was sent home because they could no longer work. And this idea that breath is also linked to livelihoods and the disruption of livelihoods. And Stacy, your work speaks to that. I think our work complements each other in very beautiful ways. So do you want to start with perhaps explaining breath in terms of the work you've done around mining and the ghosts?
Yeah, I think for me, I've come to, and the more I research breath and come to understand breath, I've come to understand that breath, colonialism, I think first and foremost, above all things, and it's interesting because it's possibly one of the things that least attention is paid to in looking at colonial histories, but it was an attack on breath. And that's on multiple levels, both in the way of spatial planning, who gets to have lots of air around them and who are sharing a lot of breath or cramped into small spaces. Then extraction economies, and the devastation they leave on that on environments, the way environments are affected, but then also psychologically, it's become a rallying cry, I can't breathe, and that speaks on so many more levels. It also speaks to that feeling of asphyxiation we all feel when we are oppressed. And in many ways it's a definition of oppression. If you are oppression and you are being pushed down, that ability to breathe is what vanishes. And I think, on the other side of things, most of the practices of resistance to colonization have been around breath. And that's on multiple levels. It's the shared breath of protests. If we think about the toy and the use of breath in that, and breath forms a huge part of that, but also the music of jazz music, choirs as a form of kind of resistance, and poetry, which also relies on breath. And then also the idea that, we don't breathe alone. We would be sharing breath if we didn't have glass between us now. But breath is always communal. And that has been one of the great resistances, and the most powerful resistance to colonialism is moving away from individualist thinkings towards more communal kind of forms of thinking. Fanon has a wonderful term called combat breath, which is that as under colonialism we're forced to become conscious of what should be an involuntary process. But suddenly we become conscious of having to be aware of our breath because we're panting against the oppression. We're reaching for breath against the oppression. And yet combat breath also implies resistance. That breath might actually also be something that we could use against the colonists. So I think it's such a fundamental part of our history, but also our being. And it's quite funny because I'm lying here in a breathing machine and I can feel the lack of oxygen in here. So I'm already feeling a bit breathless in a breathing machine. And I wonder if it's also the ghosts of the other bodies that have inhabited this machine that are sitting on my chest at the moment.
And also the lived experiences of miners who are underground every day, and what
it means to not be able to breathe. And how, what asphyxiation actually means and how scary it is. I think we've all experienced at some point where you've gone underwater and stayed too long, or something goes over your face, or your little brother pushed a blanket around your head. And that panic when we have breath taken away, it's the fundamental of life. And I also think it's wonderful that when we talk about ghosts, or when we try to find ways to represent ghosts, they very often are as wind and breath. And one of the questions that I ask in my work is also, where does breath end and wind begin? Where does breath become wind? What are the difference between these different forces and movements of air?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I love the synergies of our work, and also thinking about breath as a form of resistance within this decolonial context is very important. So I want us to talk about breath as a form of resistance, and we know that, miners who have had their breath taken away or been put in situations where they're more susceptible and more vulnerable to having their breath taken away have also resisted in songs and protesting. And jazz is also a form of resistance which uses breath. It's not just only music, but to produce music, you also need to breathe.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's so many multiple levels on it. You know, if we think about song is not possible without breath. And most choirs and many jazz musicians, one of the things you'll do as you warm up is synergizing your breath, getting you all breathing together, because it's through that pattern of breathing to the same rhythm that song becomes possible. I also, you know, when I was in isolation, and it's quite funny sitting behind this glass thing to be talking about my time in isolation, but after I was diagnosed with TB and I was put into isolation, in the isolation ward, at the exact same time I was in isolation, there was an outbreak at one of the TB hospitals, and one of the things that have happened because of the emergence of drug-resistant tuberculosis, and of course we've talked about pharmaceutical and the pharmaceutical industrial complex, and one of the reasons we're developing drug-resistant tuberculosis is because of the overdiagnosis and the prevalence of antibiotics in our water, in our foods, in our, you know, in meat, as you know, which are also, so there's this huge prevalence of this, which is leading to, you know, TB that at the moment cannot be treated. And this has led to the emergence of hospitals that start to resemble prisons, i.e. they have guards, i.e. they have high walls. And at the exact time I was in isolation, a group of 5 men broke out of one of these wards with the aim to return home to their families. And it's a story that's so complex and so interwoven, because of course the tragedy is what they're carrying back to their families is death.
Secondary outbreaks.
And at the same time, that desire to be amongst loved ones and be with people who you care about during times of weakness and illness is also just so human. And one of the beautiful little moments in the story as well, or one of the powerful moments, I don't know if it's beautiful, was that the way the patients started to realize that the guards feared their breath, because TB is airborne, it's spread via breath. And so what they did was they ripped off their masks and ripped the guards' masks off and threatened to breathe on them. And that's how they managed to make their escape out of the hospital. And there was also just something so powerful in that breath actually can be a weapon. It's not just a resistance.
Exactly.
It actually is a weapon in some ways, or can be weaponized. And so I think it's such a complex thing and such a huge part of our existence. And in many ways that story illustrates so many of the complexities of our health system. And there aren't easy answers to any of this. Who's right, who's wrong? The authorities are trying to protect the community from people who have a disease. The community don't necessarily understand the diagnosis or the conditions they've been held from. We're in a country where medicine has a long history of extreme violence that was subjected to, certain people were subjected to testing, as we've talked about, certain people were subjected to experiments, and we can't, that history is ingrained in people, and as we move forward we have to find ways to actually counter that history and not replicate it.
I couldn't agree with you more. And just thinking about the synergies again with our work, you know, it's telling stories of people who have had their breath disrupted and how that has materialized in their lives. What is the consequence of having your breath disrupted and you lose your job, and you're then paid out money from a mining company, but it's not enough for you to take care of the illness you've contracted, whether it be TB or silicosis. And I think capturing those stories is also a form of resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, with the recent class action court cases that happened against the miners, much of the evidence that came from that case was enacted against the major mining companies, with people wanting compensation for the lives that had been lost, and the way the mining companies were complicit in spreading silicosis and tuberculosis. And a lot of the evidence that was used was drawn from the large archive that's actually in law. The mining companies, when somebody dies, are forced to take tissue samples as evidence so that they can be analyzed as to what was the cause of death and to understand who's culpable. And so there's this huge database of archive of thousands of miners, and it's both, again, the complexity, because there's an absolute horror to that, of bodies flattened down to a little sample of their lungs, and these lungs emptied of air and put between a slide, and yet at the same time it was those voices that spoke in evidence, that testified in a way. So, you know, one of my questions is, how do we hear the breaths of those people? How do we make space for those lives that have been lost, and to hear the stories that maybe aren't written down, but maybe if we listen are being carried on the wind and being carried on shared breaths, and that maybe we all contain inside of us. So yeah, again, the absolute complexity of both the violence and the resistance.
And it's so painful to think about that Egoli, Johannesburg, was built and made by miners. Our fortunes, how the city came about, by people who were structurally forced to have their breath removed from them.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, we are walking on holes in the earth that are connected to the holes in my body. But, you know, I like to say my country is full of holes, and so is my body. And, you know, we were walking on top of a graveyard of thousands of lives that were lost because of that. And, you know, if you measure from the deep south gold mine in South Africa, which is the deepest gold mine in one of the deepest gold mines in the world, all the way up to the top of the Carton Tower, or if you measured the Carton Tower from that gold mine's deepest shaft, it would be the tallest building in the world. So that question of where is the surface, what's hidden below our feet, what histories do we erase, what don't we see? And then, you know, there's also something that's incredible about the invisibility of breath, that it's one thing that is fundamental to us, yet we can't see, and we also struggle to describe it, you know. Talk about breath, and it's very hard to find language, and yet the whole of language and our ability to talk is based on our breath. We would not be having this conversation without breath. And yet it's something that's so hard to describe and to give language to. And the feeling of asphyxiation is also very hard to describe, and different asphyxiation. There's the psychological, I can't breathe, I feel oppressed. There's the literal, running out of air. There's the feeling when you're breathing very polluted air, dust-filled air, which is what miners breathe daily. So, you know, there are all these complexities and complex layers, that come with breath, and yet it's so fundamental for life.
And I think a good concluding point would be that we're working on ways to speak about breath and find new languages to talk to some of the issues that you've raised. The inability to describe breath, the inability to actually really describe how you're being suffocated. And I think it's important work, because language is also an integral part of the decolonial practice.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the importance is also that it's a conversation.
Yes.
That we're not talking down to anyone, that
Exactly.
it's got to be done by a shared breath.
You refer to yourself as a capitalist machine. So could you please elaborate a little bit more to the audience and myself what that means?
Okay, it was very easy for me, because when I got every single medical aid bill and added it up over the 16 years that I've had stage 4 cancer twice and 2 metal legs and everything that goes in amongst that, including a stem cell transplant, it was looking like I had spent upwards of, I would say, I'm going to say 3 million when I had a look at everything. And that's not just little checkups and stuff. And it's made me start to think of the business that is the medical system. Oncology, I don't know if you know this, but oncology and chemotherapy particularly is the only substance that a doctor can buy and then resell to a patient at a profit. So it made me think about a lot of this. And I'm a machine because I have 2 huge metal legs that I bought, which don't function that well, but I bought them and they are what they are. So yes, I'm a capitalist machine.
Thank you for informing us. And it makes me think about the global politics of who gets access to medicine and who doesn't, because I think your story is very unique. And a lot of people in disadvantaged situations might not have the access to care and the ability to buy the technology that you could. So I want you to just comment on that and reflect on that.
The thing I think we also have to understand is the business of the Western medical system, which is a lot around innovations, conferences, prestige, patenting, and the machine of I'm going to do an experiment and it's going to get me along the way and it's going to make business and money. When I call myself a capitalist machine, I also think of the business that I gave the doctors and the surgeons who took the research that they did on this very unusual presentation of cancer, and they took it to conferences and they got professorships and they got more funding. And I did not consent, in a sense, to a lot of that. So in a way, I've fueled the capitalist machine of Western medicine. When it comes to access, I think that that's really difficult because I think I had choosing power. I had medical aid. I was able to say, okay, I'll buy that, I'll get that with informed consent. How's it going to work for me? Okay, it's still worth the risk. But I think that a lot of people, particularly in state hospitals or in rural areas where there's a clinic, do not have access to the same information. There's a reverence of doctors, and they have a lot of power in what they're going to give. And I think the exchange is not equal. Consent, body autonomy, how it's done. I even see that in the very, very kind of white middle class medical aid spaces, private hospital spaces, is still, patients are like, yes, doctor, what? Oh, yes, I'll have it. Yeah. So we have to kind of change that way of thinking and talking. And I agree with you. It's not equal. The access is not equal. The money issue is not equal. And there are people very cynically thinking about what I can get out of this exchange.
That's very true. And I'm just thinking about your comment on the effects of chemotherapy and what it's done to your brain and how it affects your ability to remember particular things. And I'm very interested in this idea of toxicity and the afterlife of chemicals, right? Because I'm sure you weighed the odds when it was time for chemo, and you weighed the odds that, do I take this chemo might have an after effect.
It does.
And it lingers in your body. And I think it resonates with quite a lot of work that I do around toxicity and female miners, where I worked with platinum miners and who often worked underground whilst pregnant, knowingly that they're exposing themselves to chemicals which could affect their baby and themselves and the future generations to come, because chemicals have the ability to move across generations. And they weighed their odds, And because they found themselves in very precarious situations where, you know, while mining policy states that if you're pregnant, you work above ground, they'll find you an alternative job above ground. But sometimes the number of alternative jobs on the surface exceeds the number of pregnant women. And what that does is, if you report your pregnancy in the first trimester and there's no alternative job on the surface, they send you home without a pay, but you will get your maternity leave, right? And so women are weighing the odds of chemical exposure and can I provide for my family, and this is the only way to do it. So this work on toxicity and the remnants of toxicity, and thinking about just even your experience, you had to weigh the odds.
You do, and you're also speaking to the toxicity of the system itself. When you're thinking of somebody who feels that they have to hide something because they know actually that the way they've spoken to from their bosses, from the clinic people, from the nurses, is in bad faith. They are not going to get the help they need. And so they don't disclose. And we are living in this coercive society. We are living in a society where our body has to have a meaning, and it has to be useful for something. So as a disabled person, I am useless for a whole lot of things, and I am deemed useless. And so I try to, in the art space, and as a therapist particularly, I try to advocate for how I can have worth, how I can see myself as worthy. But getting back to what you're saying, it's heartbreaking, because it just speaks to how much we actually know instinctively that these systems are not to be trusted, that we can't ask for help there. And tiny little thing, I do remember the first time I had cancer, I was a single mom of a 5-year-old, and I knew there was something wrong, and I let it, I understand entirely. I am white, so I have that privilege, but I think that class issue and being a parent, especially if you're carrying a child, it's heartbreaking. And it just shows us how the systems are failing us.
I couldn't agree with you anymore. We're in this space.
We are.
In this setting.
Can I sell you some quackery?
And one
will be 500,000 pounds.
And one cannot help but wonder how indigenous knowledge has been incorporated into contemporary medicine, and yet indigenous knowledge is not being acknowledged. They're not being acknowledged in modern day contemporary medicine. And that is a form of violence for me. And I think I want us to reimagine in a decolonial context what that would mean to acknowledge indigenous knowledge and level it on the same pedestal as biomedicine.
I do practice my ancestral practice of Wicca, which is from the British Isles. It's a pagan practice that predates the Roman colonization. When I think of all indigenous practices all over the world pre-colonialism, they are more focused. They are focused on two different things. They are focused on healing and community. So not cure, but healing and community. So the plants and the remedies that you were taking were part of your exchange with an elder, who would also be asking you about, are you happy and what's going on, and are you lonely and all those things. Let's take this, but the end result is to not live longer. The end result is to fit in the community more. We've broken that. The second thing is, because it's been co-opted and patented by the capitalist system, there's a monetary value attached to it, where it was never there in indigenous practices. And again, I just want to point out that indigenous healing practices the world over, from the dawn of us, were not around a timeline. They were never around a timeline, which I find ironic, because the very thing I bought for a huge amount of money has no warranty or guarantee at all. Yeah. So in a perfect world, we'd get back to that. What is healing? What does it feel to be healed? I might have a window of 2 years, but I'm healed.
Yeah.
So it's not interesting how long you live.
And I think it's really important for the biomedical system and doctors not just to think of patients as somebody to cure, but also think about holistic healing, because I think what biomedicine does relies on that Cartesian dualism where you treat the mind and the body as two separate entities, and what we should be doing is people are more complex than that.
100%.
We are in tune with our illnesses, our ailments, and we experience them in our body, but we also are making sense of them in our minds, and there needs to be an integration to put the two together if we're actually to think about a decolonial practice that speaks to healing as opposed to just cure.
And compassion and community living is about what is my big reason for being here. A big reason for being here can't be I just want to live longer.
Yeah.
It's not good enough. So at any point when I had to think about what I was going to do next, even if I had one choice to stay alive, I would say, what is my big reason? Who will I serve if I stay here longer? How can I be a useful object? I think that helps us, and that's decolonial practice.
Stacy, I find it, we're also dealing with metaphors, so I really find it ironic that you're holding up this card, which is actually used to see, to determine whether people can see or not. And in this section, we're going to be talking about diagnosis and the invisibility of it. And we're going to be thinking through treatment and diagnostics, and how race, class, and gender have their way in mediating who gets what treatment, which disease or ailment gets seen. And I think that you have a very unique story to share with us that speaks to this. So do you want to start with your story?
I mean, I think maybe just to kind of frame it with text, and I love text, so I'm always excited when there are words on a page as a writer. But, I think that there's also, we're talking about metaphors, and I think that there's also this incredible danger of it being ableist. When we're talking about race and gender and we use the metaphor of sight, there's just the need to be self-conscious of that it's an ableist position to see not seeing or especially within the context of optometry room. So I just want to enter the space with that. Having said that, though, I do think that there is a lot that goes unseen, and maybe we can try and make visible in other ways some of those things. One of the things people ask me, as I said at the beginning of this, is that I lived for 8 years with undiagnosed tuberculosis, and people go, but how could you, in this day and age, have it undiagnosed? And when I think back, because it wasn't for a lack of trying, I went to see 5 specialists. And thinking back on it, I realized how much of it was a question of race, class, gender. I was as a white woman, I'm not your typical TB, person who gets TB sufferer. And I think that it was much easier for doctors, and one of them actually went so far as to say to me that I was a hypochondriac anorexic. And that was at the point that I stopped seeing Western medicine. And that, of course, is also a hugely gendered perspective. Only a male doctor would say that. Every time I tell that story, my friends have got to be a male doctor. Because that as a woman, you must be having an hysterical response. It must be hypochondria. You're over-exaggerating these symptoms. So it's layers of complexity around that. Then there are other layers of complexity that at the time I was tested, the only test for TB in South Africa was a sputum test. They've now moved to also doing blood tests. But at that time, only the sputum test was used. And the reason being is that it's the cheapest test. And what can South Africa afford? And the other tests are far more expensive. So there's both a macro economics happening here, which is on people are seen as TB is a poor disease, but then also globally, who can afford to pay for treatments, who can't, which countries can use which tests and what's available to people. So there are layers of complexity around this. And after I finally got a diagnosis after 8 years, which only came about because I had an accident and went into hospital to get a shoulder replacement. At that point, one of the doctors, when he told me I had TB, he asked me, does your job take you to the township? And I found that statement one of the most, it was in fact probably the most offended I was in any of my medical moments, because it both implied that only if my job could take me to the township would I be going to a township, not because I have friends there so it was that really apartheid thinking. And then also because obviously only black people, and I must have contracted this from black people if I have TB. I couldn't have contracted it from one of my white friends, So that stigmatization of how TB is stigmatized and how diseases, and I found it fascinating that diseases are raced. That certain diseases, cancer is a white disease, TB is a black disease. But we all know that the bacteria, fortunately, and this is why I like bacteria so much, they're not racist, unlike us. So I think that, the language and the way we attach things and concepts to things, and this is also talking about metaphors, the black disease. Ironically, of course, it was a disease that was brought to South Africa by colonialism. South Africa was in the late 1800s advertised, during TB epidemics in Europe, advertised as a destination for people to go to get good weather, clean air. Ironically, of course, that same colonialism that was advertising the clean air of the colonies, well, we now are in Johannesburg, go outside and breathe the air, and this is a result of colonialism, mining, extraction economies. It's also what makes miners vulnerable to TB. So you see all how these things, there's a deep connection between all these layers of things.
I think you've mentioned very profound things, and I am, because I deal with a lot of work around TB, I'm very offended that TB is associated with poverty and brown bodies, and yet scientifically we know that TB bacterium spreads in the air, but as you were speaking, I think there were several points and conversations I wanted to have with you. And the one is a critique on the biomedical culture, in the sense that it does not take into account sensorial experiences. And I think that is important and needs to be acknowledged by practitioners, because you knew something was wrong, and yet you were gaslit. And you were gaslit, like you knew for a very long time, and you know your body, and those forms of knowledge should be incorporated in Western medicine.
Absolutely. I mean, I love the use of the term gaslighting in this context, and I'll speak to that first, and then unpack a bit about like the question of sensorial experience. One of the things that when you're told there's nothing wrong with you, despite the fact that there is something, you're feeling something wrong with you, there was a lot of thinking, well, I'm crazy, they must be right, I'm the hypochondriac, they're the expert. So it leads to a lot of kind of self-questioning and self-doubt, to the extent that when I was told I had TB, I wanted to throw a party. I was like, yes! And the doctors are looking at me like I'm crazy. But I was so happy it had a term and it had a diagnosis, and that I wasn't just the crazy woman. there's another kind of side to that which was so much of what I was trying to make sense of what was happening to me. I could feel changes in my body. I was losing weight. And I had a profound sense that there was something inside my body. I used to joke to my boyfriend that the alien's acting up. My digestive system was very badly affected, so I would also get lots of stomach growls, when I was unwell. And TB waxes and wanes as a disease. So you have times when it goes active and then it'll go into remission a bit and come back, which also makes for it's not like you're always sick. So then you say, then people you just having a bad day, you haven't been taking care of yourself. It gave people excuses to the disease's own behavior. But I started to come up with my own language for it. I was talking about the alien that lives in me. I was very aware there was something inside of me and that it changed me. And there were quite strange things that happened that I think aren't explained in medical diagnostics. My personality changed quite radically with being ill, which of course because it's transformative. You think I became much more political. I in fact quit my job and volunteered at Chimurenga magazine from when I went sick. I also took all my clothes in my cupboard. I unpacked my cupboard, and I can't rationally explain why I did this. Put them in bags, walked outside. I was living in Greenpoint at the time, and there were prostitutes who would work on our corner, and I'd become quite friendly with them. And I marched out the house, and I gave them everything. And then kind of had to start from kind of scratch. But my way I dressed changed, which was also, of course, that none of the stuff fitted me anymore, but there was something else that happened. I became much more politicized. There was a real sense of a radical transformation in myself. And when I was finally diagnosed and I started researching TB, one of the books that I read was Susan Sontag's Illness is a Metaphor. And of course, Sontag's, and it comes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, Sontag's point is, of course, that metaphors are dangerous and illness is not a metaphor. Illness is something very real. It's in your body. We can't talk metaphorically. She critiques the use of metaphor, and she unpacks the metaphors that have been used, and she looks at how TB was understood metaphorically in the 18th and 19th century in Europe. And a lot of it's around vampire myths, the idea that something's sucking your blood because people would get very, very kind of thin, the idea of succubuses that would come at night. And I think that I started to realize that if I'd read those metaphors instead of the diagnostic manuals, I would have gone, oh, I have TB, because it's so much more gave life to the quality. And I think this is where we talk about the importance of storytelling, narrative, but also poetry and poetics, that diseases, I can't talk rationally about this. I can write a poem maybe, but I can't talk it in scientific language. And that's a shift that I think is so important. We need to start rethinking diagnostic criteria outside of these languages to more incorporate how people, and it's also cultural, how you speak about the disease is culturally informed.
And you've just prompted me. A lot of the work I do with miners is to look at their understandings of mercury poisoning. And what is very interesting is mercury poisoning has this list, this diagnostic criteria that, if you experience aches and pains, nausea, you have blue gums, or, just fatigue in general, those are symptoms of mercury poisoning. And I work with artisanal miners, and their reading of those symptoms is very different. So the reading of the same set of symptoms is very different. It can be explained away by the fact that they live in very precarious situations. Fatigue could be explained away by the fact that they work incredibly hard jobs and it's labor taxing, Coughing, again, could be perceived as just inhaling too much smoke from using wood for firewood, or and this has always been my critique, that these diagnostic criterias in biomedicine do not take into account the everyday, the
Yeah.
lived reality,
Yeah.
and they're treated as separate. And if we actually want to make particular diseases or illnesses visible, we need to be incorporating people's lived experiences.
And how they speak their disease.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they're very different ways of reading the body, but there's only one that is privileged, which is biomedicine, and we need to be at that point. And this is why this decolonial project is so important, because we're advocating for doctors and practitioners to look at the diagnostic criteria, but also to look in conjunction with their lives, with the lived realities of people.
I mean, I could completely relate, and speaking quite differently, and it's a privileged position again, of course. But at the time when I got very ill from TB, it was just before I had the accident. And in fact, when I was diagnosed, the doctor said you had 1 month to live. And I was aware I'd lost even more weight. I was looking dreadful. My friends were saying, no, we're concerned about you. But I was going through a breakup, and I was heartbroken. And I explained all those things as heartbreak. And those clear lines, like how does heartbreak feel different from TB? I don't know.
Yeah,
that discernment is very hard to say. They kind of feel the same. You know, this hurts. This really hurts. And in some ways, I think, you know, given the choice, I would take TB over heartbreak any day. But so I think that question, and I think, you know, I think it's about doctors and practitioners taking that into account. But I also think as artists, as writers, as medical anthropologists, we have a role to play in trying to bring those stories to life. And I know we talked about like ideas that could emerge from this. And one of the things we talked about that I loved was this idea of maybe trying to create a poetic diagnostic manual that incorporates lived experiences and the language people use and the metaphors people use. You know, within South Africa, many of our languages are so metaphoric and so poetic in explaining things. Things aren't explained directly. They're often talked about from other directions.
I want to speak about, I look at your Instagram posts quite often, and I really love the fact that you use Instagram as a way of producing knowledge, but also producing knowledge that's very accessible. And in some of your Instagram posts, you talk about your issue or your problem with biomedicine or the culture of biomedicine. And particularly in relation to heteronormativity and ableism. So I was wondering if you could just share where your frustration comes from.
My frustration, I think, started in 2022 when I was diagnosed, and I had to remind people all the time that I was non-binary, and I did not want to be called Mrs. Westerhout, which was the default. Everyone had a look at me, and I was Mrs. Westerhout. And I worked and worked and worked at it. I also was very misgendered in quite a horrible and violent way by a doctor, a white heterosexual doctor who arrived on a Sunday, walked toward me. I was not in a good space. I was busy with chemo, and he decided it was a fantastic time to stand there and be like a little mini computer and push out the statistics on my survival rate. And two things he put in there, and he said was female and my age. So it was that kind of trigger of being listening to ageism and misogyny and queerphobia that kind of made me think I need to start advocating for myself. And that's really where a lot of my work, even while I was in the chemo ward, and I would start thinking, how can I start practicing this? And art is such a great place to do it because it is about storytelling, it is about advocacy. So yeah.
Thank you for sharing that story with us, because I think it's important to share these stories and hopefully biomedical practitioners hear this and are more sensitive towards these issues and topics. Just continuing with the issue of biomedicine and Western culture of medicine, you seem very passionate about consent, and it's something that comes up a lot in your work. And my understanding of the way you've framed consent, and I'd never thought about it like that, as consent also being a form of violence.
When we understand the framework of consent from a kind of a queer theory, because consent in the theory that I'm putting forward is actually from the transformative justice stable, and it's really been innovated by queer people, indigenous people, as a pushback, as a decolonial pushback against these monoliths. And so where we understand consent is really kind of the rubber hitting the road, is to understand we actually live in a coercive society. From children, as children, we are coerced into behaving, into being, into going places. We go to school, it's a coercive environment, we're told we have to. And if you think of, for example, the consent form as a child at the school, a parent signs that for the child is still not sure what they're doing, and they haven't maybe been asked what the field trip or do they want to go. But a parent is signing a consent form, and really the reason for that consent form is a liability release. Exactly the same in the Western medical system. You sign a consent form. I remember for my I've blanked out because it was so fucking traumatic. The stem cell basically. When they stuck a fucking huge needle in my hip and took the stem cells out. Sorry about the swearing, but it was bad. I was told it is mild discomfort. Here's the consent form, and would you sign? And it was really a release form in case something happened. So I was there, and I was on the bed, and it was the most excruciating thing I'd ever had in my life, and I was fully awake, and I was screaming. And I remember feeling absolute rage and walking back into the room and going, why didn't you tell me? Why do you use those words? I would never have signed there. Now, what we understand about consent from the transformative justice and queer theory is that consent, and it's not just around sex, consent everywhere must be informed. I need to know the full ramifications of what it is I'm saying yes to, because then my consent is enthusiastic. What we also understand is once I consent to something, I then am accountable for it. And it must be reversible, which doesn't really fit into the medical system particularly. So for example, when I was advocating for myself with doctors, even if I had at one point last year one option left, which was the stem cell transplant, because my cancer would not go away. I tried to frame it for myself by saying to the doctor, listen, I know I have one option left, but you're going to tell me all about it, and I'm going to think of it as I'm buying this from you because I know what the pros and cons are, and so it is a logical and consensual decision from me. And in that way, I could take accountability. I still though had to sign the consent form to release them. And as I said before, there is no guarantee for that work.
What you're saying is so important, and I'm just thinking of the hierarchy between patient and doctor, and how that often plays, because you are ill, you need help, so you're just consenting, and we should be informed fully. Why are you running these tests? And I think biomedicine takes that for granted, that, oh, okay, we just need to do bloods. What bloods are you doing? What is it that you want to see? And that should be properly communicated, and that isn't. And in reimagining what consent would look like in a decolonial context. I think it is about informing people. Everything. What is it that you're signing to? The pain might be more than mild. So people actually know. And I think I just wanted to end with a story. There's a story you told me that stuck with me about consent and a cancer patient who passed away but wasn't given all the knowledge. You know, how much time do you have to live, and that was kept from him. And I just want you to speak to that story, because I do think that not giving consent and adequate consent robs people of time, of, you know, in this context, time.
Yeah, I think when you're a cancer patient, you're required to be two things: grateful and quiet, and very lucky for everything. And so what I saw with people who were dying, and that was me at one point, is this the doctor knows, and so we put our faith in the doctor. But the doctor is doing things because, yes, there's a Hippocratic oath, but they're also meeting on a Friday morning to discuss what they're doing with everyone and how it's serving them. So not all the motivations are pure. We are all experiments. All of us are experiments. We are all adding to the bulk of their knowledge. Sometimes it's good. For example, you know, I think tech and innovations and medicine, I am living because of them. What I have a problem with is the culture of it. And it comes right down to a nurse saying, we're going to take bloods. Would you like a moment? How do you feel? Should we stop? Would you like to breathe? May I come towards you? There are tiny, tiny things you can do to make a person feel that, yes, even they've got no choices like I had, no choices, they're still allowed to say a yes. I think that would make the world of difference, because our world is very small when we're very sick. And I am sorry for my friend who was not told properly what was going on, because I think that he wasn't able to prepare. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really painful.
Yeah. I'm angry. I'm angry, and I remember saying, don't do that with me. If I'm circling the drain, for reals, you tell me so I can get out of here and I can go home. I don't want this nonsense. I don't want me to be waiting. Dying is work. Dying is hard work. You must focus. You must get ready. You must do your things. You must settle up. You must work out where you're going. That cannot happen in traumatic environments. It's hard work, dying. I've seen it many, many times. You have to be focused and relaxed for it.
Welcome to our last scene, and we are protesting to conclude. Rather, we want to open up a space to reimagine decolonial practices. What is it that we can learn from here, and what is it that we can carry through? And so, Louise, do you want to start?
It just came to me that my big issue with conclusion is that it is somehow seen as meaning a death of something. And so in the speak of cancer survival, when you die, you've somehow lost a battle with something, or you're a loser, or shame. And there are people walking around in the world fully healthy, who I don't see as winners particularly. And so I want to say, could we please change our idea of death as a conclusion? Could we please keep our minds open about what we're here to do for as long as we have, And I think of this as a very personal activism because I am in a window of quite a short amount of time that I have left. I have between 2 to 5 years, statistically, and I don't want to think of my death as a conclusion. So while I'm here, I want to have fun, and I want to make work, and I want to ask difficult questions and have interesting conversations.
Thank you. That is very powerful. Stacy?
I mean, I suppose my resistance is to conclusions is I don't think that's how the world works. Certainly I know, as somebody who went through TB and they give you your thousands of pills that you have to take, and they say, oh, take these and you will be cured. I was on an 8-month course. But of course, while you no longer have TB bacteria in you, your body is fundamentally changed. So you never actually are the same person because you've been through this radical transformative experience. But TB doesn't also leave you, you don't suddenly return to full health. So there's a growing move to recognize what they're now calling post-TB. And just even that term indicates that things don't end. And I think we need to start rethinking our idea of what is cure to different forms of how do we live with things, how do we change this idea that of what is health. You know, what actually is health. So I suppose that's partially some of my resistance. And then I suppose it's also that clean, tidying up, tie the little ribbon and everything's nicely contextualized. And I'm just not that kind of person. I always have the thought after the end and things are always frayed and left unfinished and the edges are always jagged. There's not that smooth wrapping up.
That is very true. And I think also a part of my resistance to conclude is to think about the impact of our work, to think about perhaps adding this to a syllabus that makes students and medical practitioners more sensitive, more aware, and include decolonial methodologies, which we've all drawn on. So we've drawn on embodied experience, we've drawn on phenomenology, we've also drawn on art as a way to express and to comment on issues, whether it be health inequality, to the unfairness of being named and tagged with a particular disease or ailment. And we also want to produce a generation of what I imagine of scholars and creative practitioners that are representative of the issues that we're speaking about, because I think that's so important, representation. We want to see work from the Global South by people from the Global South that speak to a lot of the health issues and the complexities of health in a way that carries integrity and care, and moving away from this gaze that, you know, if you look at a lot of work around TB or even AIDS treatment, this idea that people are non-conforming without taking into account what the lived reality is. And that is important, and we need to juxtapose that in how we critically analyze concepts.
I mean, I think for me, the big thing to answer the question of, you know, what's next to open up the possibility, imagining new world, I suppose a big thing for me, both the next in my research, is to try to more fully understand what it means not just to be singular, you know, what it means not to be singular, but that to understand, to try to move to an understanding of the intense relationships we have with all the things that inhabit our body, with other beings, that this idea of the human as individual, isolated, closed off subject just does not reflect our reality. Our stomachs are filled with thousands of bacteria, and we now know those affect our moods, they affect our thinking. So we're thinking in conjunction with other organisms. So who is Stacy? Where does Stacy end and the bacteria begin? Can we rethink how we're positioning ourselves and what our relationships are to the other beings, creatures, even objects that we share the world with and share our body with, this body with. Yeah.
As an anti-speciesist, I thought so much in my treatments as to how many animals and people who were deemed less than were used as test subjects to get the perfect treatment that I was given and that I paid for. And often we're asked as not anti-speciesists or vegans then, what would you do on a desert island though if you were stuck and there was just you and a pig and, you know, nonsense like that. And I want to answer that I've actually done that, because in the stem cell transplant unit, not only was I there knowing how many people, humans and non-humans, had been used to get me this treatment, and how I was going to speak for them and advocate for them. But I was given food that I wasn't able to eat because I said that I needed particular food. And so I starved. And when you have a stem cell transplant, you need a lot of protein, you need to eat, and I didn't have that. And instead of eating what was being offered, I didn't take it. So I know what I would do. I know what I would do. And I was very proud of myself that I did not prioritize my body over the life and body of another person beyond what I could control. And so I do feel that I need to speak to those non-humans whose lives we don't speak about.
One of the questions that will always haunt me and that I think we don't ask enough was that question that I asked myself, which is, well, it's more a statement, but that we all make our lives by the deaths of others. We do. And that our bodies and our lives are enabled by the deaths of others. And you don't need to be a cancer survivor or a TB survivor or involved in any of these things for that to be the truth. Because everything we use, when one looks at, for example, when I started to track kind of where the titanium, that's my metal shoulder, comes from, that is coming from mining. I looked at the places where the titanium mines are, at places like the Congo, like South America, like Chile, and people are dying in those mines. Same thing in the South African gold mine. So everything, my entire wealth, the fact that I had food to eat, food on the table every day as a white South African, was because of a history of people who died. And we can't eliminate that culpability. That doesn't mean we should be walking around, oh my God, you know, because this is the way the world is, but a consciousness, a consciousness and an attuneness. And I think that point you raised about fashionable, I'm always aware, you know, it was very fashionable to have TB in the 19th century. And where it was romanticized and it was seen as the artistic disease. Now it's seen as a disease that's kind of vilified, and a poor disease, a disease of poverty, a black disease. So these fashions move in and out, and we all have fashions. It's now, I hate to say this, but it is. It's fashionable to talk about Palestine, but not to talk about the Sudan, not to talk about Chad, not to talk about, so when we're talking about death, we have to also aware who all these things are manipulated via media, via complex things. And we need to think carefully how we just follow trends, how we talk about things, carry that kind of realization, and carry the realization that sitting in a medical museum surrounded by the ghosts of all the people who died and who lived, who were given life and who were sentenced to death. by what we're surrounded by.
And experimented on.
I think it's a beautiful space to think that with, and that I think we need to think more with the ghosts and be more aware of them, because maybe they'll lead us to that realization of how lucky and blessed we are to be in this world and to be where we are.
But also how I think, as you said, that awareness and being able to say, I'm making a calculated choice now, that yes, my stainless steel and titanium comes from there. It has involved people who are going to die because of what I have now. How will I speak about it? And I think this is a great platform to I don't know their names. I don't know their names. I don't know the names of any being who is dead, so I'm alive. And that again brings this whole idea of death and living. And is my life worth it? It's not. Of course it's not. For me in that moment it was. But I can't stand behind it in any way. And so I guess that's what most of us are doing here, is we're trying to redress that. We're trying to speak for those people. We don't have their names because they are multitudes, you're right. And they are all around us and in us. But if we could just speak to it and say we understand it and we're trying.
Yeah. And that leads us also very beautifully to the idea that death is not an end. You know, because they're miraculous ways where things live on. We carry those dead, but in some way their lives, they do live on. You know, I always feel like my body is filled with the ghosts of dead miners, the comrades who died trying to end apartheid, but it's also filled with new possibilities. It's filled with new life. It's filled with bacteria that move between things. So that closed off idea of a death that's all finished, which I guess it leads us maybe nicely to say that this is our invitation to everybody to continue this conversation.
It is, yes. I don't think we're concluding anything.
We're not, yeah. We're inviting people to be in conversation with us, and so we can work and collaborate with people who identify with this cause and with the work that we're trying to do.
And also by not concluding, you're understanding that you might be making mistakes or getting it wrong or saying it wrong, or really just not specifically enough or clear enough. And I think that I stand for that, is that we'll all go away tonight and think we could have said something else, and that's okay, because death,
And I think it's also a nice point to bring in that call for generosity, that we're all struggling to find language, to talk these things. There isn't a textbook to talk these things. And because we're all struggling, we're all stuttering, stammering, sometimes we say the wrong thing, sometimes we say something that's going to upset somebody else. But that's not the intention. And I suppose it's that generosity and that willingness to let's all try to find ways to make things that don't fit easily into mouths be spoken, and to find language for things that haven't been languaged, or maybe even can't be languaged.